Jack Nolan had always lived in the comfort of the mundane, his world defined by clean camera cuts, predictable edits, and the small satisfaction of seeing his work light up the screens of his modest client base. As a freelance videographer, he didn't need excitement. His life was enough of a balancing act between creative ambition and financial survival. Cedarwood, the small town he called home, mirrored his simplicity. It was unassuming on the surface, a place where every face knew the other. But beneath its quaint exterior, Cedarwood had its shadows. Unsolved disappearances whispered their way through decades, a grim undercurrent that lingered in every wooded path and lonely street. Jack didn't dwell on it. Like most of the town, he avoided those dark corners of history. One uneventful evening, Jack returned home from a lukewarm date, more drained than disappointed. He hadn't even bothered with a follow-up message. The conversation had been polite, but forgettable. Lighting a cigarette by his small desk, Jack powered up his laptop, scrolling past unread emails with detached efficiency. His eye caught a subject line that stood out among the clutter. Opportunity from Cedarwood Grill. Headline? He clicked it, the faint glow of the screen washing over his tired face. Hi, Jack. My name is Danny Carter, and I'm the owner of Cedarwood Grill, a new restaurant on the edge of town. I was referred to you by Sonia at Bella's Bistro. She had nothing but praise for your work. I'd love to hire you to shoot a promotional video for us. We're hoping to capture something unique to really put us on the map. We're a family-run establishment with a commitment to local flavor. Let me know your rates and availability. Best regards, Danny Carter. Jack's brow furrowed as he read, Cedarwood Grill? He'd never heard of it, and Cedarwood wasn't exactly known for its burgeoning culinary scene. The mention of Sonia, though, was reassuring. She was a no-nonsense woman who ran Bella's Bistro with an iron hand and made the best paninis in town. If Sonia trusted Danny, that meant something. But the phrase, local flavor, lingered oddly in his mind, twisting into something vaguely sinister when paired with the restaurant's location. Right on the outskirts, near the forest, where no one dared tread. Still, it was work, and Jack wasn't one to turn down a job. He replied with his rates and some open dates, then leaned back in his chair. Outside, the wind hissed through the streets, rattling the window panes like a warning whispered on glass. The next day, Jack's phone rang. The voice on the other end was warm, charismatic, and laced with a faint southern drawl. Jack Nolan? Danny Carter here? I'm thrilled to hear from you. Sonia speaks highly of your work. You've got a gift for making things shine. Danny's enthusiasm was infectious, but beneath it, there was an edge. Jack agreed to meet him the following week. As the call ended, a chill ran down Jack's spine. Maybe it was the way Danny said fresh that unsettled him, but Jack shook it off. He was imagining things. Probably. The day of the shoot dawned gray and cold, with a mist clinging stubbornly to the trees. Jack loaded his equipment into his car and drove toward the edge of town, where Cedarwood Grill sat like a forgotten relic at the forest's edge. The restaurant loomed ahead, its rustic wood paneling and dimly glowing sign standing in stark contrast to the encroaching darkness of the woods behind it. The neon letters of Cedarwood Grill, where local flavor meets family tradition, hummed faintly, their red glow casting eerie shadows on the damp ground. Jack stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel lot. The forest loomed unnaturally still, its twisted branches clawing at the gray sky. A bell above the restaurant door jingled as he entered, and he was greeted by the sweet scent of roasted meat mingled with something sharper, metallic. The dining area was warm, with polished wood tables and walls adorned with faded photographs of Cedarwood's history. Yet, despite the cozy setting, an uneasy stillness seemed to hang in the air, as though the room itself was holding its breath. A young waitress approached, her smile practiced but faltering slightly when she saw Jack's equipment. "Welcome to Cedarwood Grill," she said, her blue eyes flickering with something unreadable. "How many are we seating today?" "Oh, I'm here to see Danny," Jack explained. "We're filming a promotional video." Her smile tightened, and the charm drained from her face, replaced by something cold and distant. "I'll get him," she said flatly, before disappearing into the kitchen. Moments later, Danny Carter emerged. A stocky man in a plaid shirt with wild curly hair and a grin that felt just a shade too wide. "Jack!" he boomed, extending a hand that was warm but firm enough to feel like a warning. "It's good to finally meet you. Let's get to it, shall we?" Danny led Jack through the restaurant, explaining his vision for the shoot. As they entered the kitchen, the air changed. It was colder here, the warmth of the dining room replaced by a sharp chill that bit at Jack's skin. Gleaming knives lined the walls, and a massive grill hissed with fiery intensity. But it wasn't the modern equipment that caught Jack's eye. It was the old rusted meat grinder tucked in the corner, its surface darkened by age and use. Jack gestured toward it. "You grind your own meat?" Danny hesitated, his grin tightening. "We sure do. Local and fresh, like I said. But that old thing's more for show these days. Doesn't really fit the aesthetic we're going for in the video, you know?" Jack nodded, but the unease in Danny's voice didn't escape him. He moved on, filming the chefs preparing dishes while Danny hovered nearby, his presence heavier than necessary. The kitchen staff worked in silence, their eyes darting toward Danny as if awaiting unseen orders. When Jack asked to film the meat storage room, Danny's hesitation returned. We don't need that," he said quickly. "Not much to see there. Just the usual storage. Cazona says the kitchen's always been full on one night." By the end of the day, Jack had captured plenty of footage, but his unease had grown. As he packed up, Danny clapped him on the back. "How about a meal in the house? You've earned it." Jack reluctantly agreed. The waitress brought out a plate of slow-roasted meat, the aroma both mouth-watering and unsettling. The first bite melted on his tongue, but there was something about the seasoning. Something he couldn't identify, and the more he thought about it, the less he wanted to. Driving home through the mist, Jack's thoughts churned. The warmth of Cedarwood Grill had felt like a mask, hiding something darker beneath. He glanced in the rearview mirror at the glowing sign, its crimson letters shrinking into the distance. As his car rumbled down the empty road, the weight in his chest deepened. Jack had taken the job for the money, but now he couldn't shake the feeling he'd stepped into something far more dangerous than a simple promotional video. The footage Jack had shot at Cedarwood Grill lay open on his laptop, its soft glow casting eerie shadows in his dimly lit apartment. It was supposed to be just another gig. Edit the clips, deliver the polished commercial, collect payment, but something about that place gnawed at him. The peculiar chill of the kitchen, Danny's overly charismatic demeanor, the lingering metallic scent that clung to the back of his throat even hours after he left. It was more than enough to keep him up late into the night, his fingers hesitating over the keyboard, as he scrubbed through the footage frame by frame. As the video played, Jack felt a strange sensation, a prickling at the back of his neck. The kitchen scenes were well lit, clean, almost sterile, but as he slowed down the playback, something flickered in the corner of the screen. A shadow, faint but undeniably human in shape, hovered just out of focus near the meat grinder. He rewound and slowed the frame even further. There it was again, a fleeting glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there. His heart began to race. The shadow didn't belong to any of the chefs. Its proportions were wrong, too tall, too thin, and it moved with a strange, almost fluid grace. Jack paused the video and stared at the figure frozen on the screen, its edges blurred and indistinct. The longer he looked, the more it seemed to look back. He shook his head, brushing off the thought as paranoia. Still, his unease lingered. He looked from... The following day, Jack decided to return to Cedarwood Grill. He told himself it was for extra Bibram, an excuse to revisit the restaurant and ease his creeping doubts. But deep down, he knew he was searching for answers. As he pulled into the gravel lot, the forest loomed larger than before, its gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the overcast sky. The neon sign buzzed faintly, the words Cedarwood Grill, where local flavor meets family tradition, flickering slightly as if they, too, held a secret. Inside, the warm aroma of roasted meat filled the air, but now it felt oppressive, as though the scent was trying to smother something darker. Danny greeted him with his usual booming charm, but Jack noticed a tightness around his eyes, a tension that hadn't been there before. "Back so soon?" Danny asked, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "What brings you by today, Jack?" "Just thought I'd grab a few extra shots," Jack replied, keeping his tone casual. "Some close-ups of the kitchen equipment, maybe the storage area. You know, the details." Danny's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Sure thing, but the storage area is nothing special. Just your usual stock. How about some shots of the dining room instead? That's where the magic happens." Jack nodded, feigning agreement, but his mind was already made up. He needed to see the storage area, the place Danny seemed so intent on avoiding. The kitchen was as Jack remembered it, bustling but unnervingly quiet. The chefs moved with mechanical precision, their faces expressionless as they chopped, grilled, and plated. Jack's camera lens swept over the gleaming knives and polished counters, capturing the pristine surfaces that felt like a lie. His gaze kept drifting toward the meat grinder in the corner. Its rusted edges darkened with stains that no amount of scrubbing could remove. When Danny was momentarily called away, Jack seized his chance. Slipping through the swinging door at the back of the kitchen, he found himself in the storage area. The air was colder here, heavy with the faint scent of blood and something older, fouler. A single flickering bulb hung from the ceiling, casting erratic shadows across the room. Rows of shelves lined the walls, stacked with unmarked boxes and crates. In the center of the room stood a large industrial freezer, its surface scarred with deep scratches. Jack hesitated before approaching, his pulse quickening with each step. The hum of the freezer filled his ears, a low, unsettling sound that seemed to grow louder as he drew near. He placed a trembling hand on the latch and pulled. The door creaked open, and a cloud of icy air billowed out, carrying with it a stench so vile it nearly brought Jack to his knees. Inside, slabs of raw meat hung from hooks, their dark red surfaces glistening in the dim light. At first glance, it looked like ordinary cuts of beef, but as Jack's eyes adjusted, he noticed something horribly wrong. The door was frozen in place. Edison, standing at the door, among the slabs were fragments that shouldn't have been there. Bits of fabric, strands of hair, the unmistakable curve of a human hand. Jack stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. His camera clattered to the ground, the lens still pointed at the gruesome contents of the freezer. He turned to leave, but the sound of approaching footsteps froze him in place. Danny's voice broke the silence, calm but laced with menace. "Jack, I told you there wasn't much to see back here." Jack spun around, his heart pounding. Danny stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching long and jagged under the flickering light. His grin was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "What the hell is this, Danny?" Jack demanded, his voice shaking. "What are you doing here?" Danny stepped closer, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, his tone almost regretful. "But now that you have, well, let's just say it's going to be hard for you to walk away." Jack backed away, his mind racing. His eyes darted to the camera on the ground, its red recording light still blinking. If he could just grab it, if he could make it out of here, he'd have proof. But Danny's presence loomed larger, his calm demeanor masking the violence Jack could feel simmering beneath the surface. "You don't understand," Danny continued, his voice taking on a sinister edge. "This isn't just about me. There are others, people who depend on what we do here, people who don't take kindly to loose ends." Jack's hand brushed against a metal shelf, and he felt something cold and sharp. A knife. Gripping it tightly, he held it up between them, his hands trembling. "Stay back, Danny. I'm leaving, and I'm taking this footage with me." Danny's grin returned, wide and unsettling. "You think that'll save you, Jack? You think anyone will believe you?" "Cedarwood has a way of keeping its secrets." As Danny lunged toward him, Jack swung the knife, barely missing as Danny sidestepped with startling speed. The two grappled, the freezer door swinging open behind them, its gruesome contents swaying on their hooks. Jack managed to break free, grabbing his camera and bolting for the exit. Danny's shouts echoed behind him, but Jack didn't look back. Outside, the forest seemed to close in, its branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Jack's car roared to life, gravel spraying as he sped away from the restaurant. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. He had the footage. He had the proof. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, the glowing sign of Cedarwood Grill flickered ominously, and the shadows of the forest seemed to move. Whatever Jack had uncovered, it was far from over. Jack's apartment had always been a safe haven, a place to escape the world and focus on his work. But tonight, it felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier, and the faint hum of his laptop carried an ominous weight. He'd locked the door, bolted it twice for good measure, yet a gnawing sense of vulnerability crept over him. The footage from Cedarwood Grill played on a loop, each frame a damning piece of evidence. His heart raced as he paused on the moment he'd caught the freezer contents in full view. There it was. The unmistakable proof of Danny's horrifying secret. A chill ran down his spine as he stared at the grainy image of a human hand hanging limply among the slabs of meat. But what haunted him more was the shadow. A figure in the background, its skeletal outline visible for only a fraction of a second before vanishing. It wasn't Danny. It wasn't anyone he recognized. Jack leaned back, rubbing his temples as his mind raced. What was Cedarwood hiding? And who, or what, was the shadow? The sound of a soft knock shattered the silence, making Jack jump. His heart pounded as he turned toward the door. It was almost midnight. Who would come by at this hour? He hesitated before approaching, his fingers hovering over the peephole. But before he could look, the knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. Jack's stomach churned as he peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He double-checked the locks, reassuring himself they were secure. Just as he stepped back, a chilling whisper echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have gone back, Jack." His blood ran cold. The voice seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, low and guttural, like a growl at the edge of human speech. He spun around, eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. The shadows along the walls seemed to stretch and writhe, taunting him with shapes that resembled faces, figures, things that couldn't be real. Jack didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind outside felt like a threat. By morning, his exhaustion turned to determination. He couldn't let fear paralyze him. He needed answers. He loaded the footage onto a secure drive and sent a copy to his friend Sarah, a journalist who thrived on exposing corruption. Her response was almost immediate. "What the hell is this? We need to talk. Call me ASAP." Jack's hands shook as he dialed her number. "Sarah, I don't know what I've stumbled into, but it's big. Bigger than I ever imagined." "I can see that," she replied, her voice sharp with urgency. "This isn't just some small-town secret, Jack. There's something unnatural about this. That shadow in the footage, it doesn't move like a person." Her words sent a shiver down his spine. He had noticed it too, but hearing it confirmed out loud made it worse. "What do you mean?" Frame by frame, it's almost like it's not bound by the same rules as everything else in the video. It flickers in and out, like it's slipping between layers of reality. Jack swallowed hard. He hadn't wanted to articulate his fears, but Sarah's description matched the sinking feeling in his gut. "I think I need to go back." "What?" Sarah's voice rose. "Are you insane? You barely made it out last time. What makes you think they'll let you walk away again?" "They don't know I have backup copies of the footage," Jack said. "If I can find out more, figure out who's involved, I can expose them." "Or get yourself killed," she countered. But Jack's silence told her he wasn't going to listen. With a resigned sigh, she said, "Fine. But if you're doing this, I'm coming with you." That evening, Jack and Sarah parked just outside the woods bordering Cedarwood Grill. The building loomed in the distance, its neon sign glowing faintly through the dense fog that had rolled in. The forest around them was deathly silent, save for the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her breath visible in the cold air. "No," Jack admitted. "But I don't think I have a choice." They approached cautiously, avoiding the main entrance and circling toward the back. The kitchen windows were dark, the restaurant seemingly closed for the night. Jack pointed to the storage area where he'd first uncovered the freezer. They slipped inside, their flashlights casting long, jagged beams across the cold, tiled floor. The stench hit them first, an overpowering mix of decay and copper. Sarah gagged, covering her mouth. "What the hell is that?" "Probably the freezer," Jack muttered, his voice barely audible. He led the way, his camera rolling for evidence. But as they reached the storage area, they realized the freezer was gone. In its place stood a gaping hole in the floor, as if something massive had been ripped out. A faint breeze wafted up from the darkness below, carrying with it an even fouler stench. Jack aimed his flashlight into the pit. A narrow set of stairs descended into blackness. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, who shook her head vehemently. "Jack, no," she whispered. "This is insane." But Jack was already moving. The stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into the abyss. The air grew colder, heavier with each step. Finally, they reached the bottom, where a long, dimly lit tunnel stretched before them. The walls were lined with crude carvings, symbols that seemed ancient, almost primal. Jack ran his fingers over one, the grooves deep and jagged, as if clawed into the stone. "What is this place?" he murmured. They ventured further, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. The tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber, and what they saw made their blood run cold. Dozens of figures stood in a loose circle, their faces obscured by masks carved from bone. In the center, a slab of stone served as an altar, its surface slick with fresh blood. The group chanted in a guttural, otherworldly language, their voices reverberating through the chamber like the growl of some ancient beast. Sarah gasped, and one of the masked figures turned. Jack grabbed her arm, pulling her back into the shadows. But it was too late. The chanting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. "Who dares intrude?" a voice boomed, deep and inhuman. Jack's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Panic surged as he fumbled for his camera. Through the viewfinder's night vision, he saw the figures closing in, their movements unnaturally fast and jerky as if they were being pulled by unseen strings. A shrill scream erupted from the group, and suddenly the shadow from his footage was there, looming impossibly tall, its elongated limbs stretching toward him like claws. Jack froze, his body paralyzed by a cold that felt as though it was seeping into his very soul. Sarah yanked him backward, snapping him out of his trance. "Run!" she screamed. They bolted back down the tunnel, the sound of footsteps and guttural growls echoing behind them. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, reaching for them, trying to pull them back. They burst out into the woods, the fresh air hitting them like a slap to the face. But they didn't stop running until they reached the car. Jack fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as the engine roared to life. Gravel sprayed as they sped away, the glow of Cedarwood Grill disappearing into the fog. Back in the safety of Jack's apartment, they sat in silence, their breaths ragged. The footage Jack had captured this time was even more damning, but he couldn't bring himself to watch it. Whatever they had stumbled upon wasn't just a secret. It was something ancient, something evil. And Jack knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. The shadows of Cedarwood had found them, and they wouldn't let go. The days following the escape from Cedarwood Grill were a blur of paranoia and unease. Jack's apartment, once his refuge, now felt like a prison. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, stretching unnaturally in the dim light, and the faint sound of whispers lingered just beyond his hearing. Every knock at the door sent his heart racing, and every flicker of a streetlight outside his window made him glance nervously at the darkened corners of the room. Now and then he used the window to check in the alley to make sure nobody was following him, but determined to be prudent. He had reviewed the footage from the cavern below Cedarwood Grill only once. It had taken all his courage to hit play, and what he saw haunted him. The figures in bone masks, the grotesque rituals, the blood-soaked altar. It was all there. But worse was the shadow. It appeared frequently, always just on the edge of the frame, its distorted limbs moving with a predatory grace. Mason pointed a pistol at the man, and the man pointed at the pistol. Once it turned to face the camera directly, its featureless face exuding an unnatural malice that made Jack slam the laptop shut. Sarah had gone silent since that night. Calls went unanswered, messages left unread. Jack couldn't shake the image of her terrified face as they fled the cavern. Her whispered, "We're not safe," looping endlessly in his mind. He wanted to believe she'd simply gone to ground, keeping her head low. But deep down, he feared the worst. On the third night after their escape, Jack awoke to the sound of footsteps in his apartment. His heart pounded as he lay frozen, listening. The steps were deliberate, slow and heavy, moving toward his bedroom door. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, but his fingers fumbled in the dark. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow, and revealed a single message from an unknown. "You can't run." The door creaked open. Jack bolted upright, his breath caught in his throat. But the room was empty. No shadow moved, no figure stood in the doorway. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. He grabbed his camera and flipped on the night vision, scanning the room through the viewfinder. And there it was. In the corner by the closet, the shadow stood, tall and hunched, its limbs twisted and wrong. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, but its presence filled the room with an oppressive weight. Jack wanted to scream, to run, but his body was frozen. Slowly, he lowered the camera, expecting it to disappear, but it didn't. It stepped forward. Jack scrambled backward, knocking over his nightstand. The shadow moved closer, its elongated arms reaching out, the air around it seeming to ripple with unnatural energy. In desperation, Jack grabbed the camera and hurled it at the thing. The room went dark as the camera hit the ground, the night vision flickering off. When the lights returned, the shadow was gone. Jack knew he couldn't stay in the apartment. He packed his things in a frenzy, throwing clothes and hard drives into a bag. He needed to leave town, to disappear before whatever Cedarwood had unleashed could claim him. As he loaded his car, he saw someone standing at the end of the street. It was Sarah. She looked disheveled, her hair matted and her clothes stained with dirt. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, darting nervously as she approached. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We can't run. They'll find us." Jack ushered her into the car, glancing around to make sure they weren't being watched. "What happened to you? Where have you been?" "They came for me," she said, her voice breaking. "I tried to hide, but they knew where I was. They always know. Jack, we have to stop them, or they'll never stop hunting us." Jack's stomach twisted. "How do we stop them? They're not just people, Sarah. That thing in the footage, it's not human." "I know," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "But I found something, a way to end this." Sarah led Jack to an abandoned church on the outskirts of town. The building was decrepit, its stained glass shattered and its pews rotting, but in the flickering light of their flashlights, Jack noticed symbols carved into the walls, similar to the ones they had seen in the cavern beneath Cedarwood. "This place," Sarah whispered, "it's older than the town, older than Cedarwood. The same group that runs the grill. They've been here for centuries, Jack. They've been feeding..." "Feeding what?" Jack asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Sarah hesitated. "The shadow. It's not a ghost or a demon. It's something worse. Something ancient. And they've been keeping it alive." She showed him a crumbling book she had found in the church's basement, its pages filled with drawings of the shadow and rituals meant to bind it. "This is the only way to stop it," she said, pointing to a page depicting a circle of fire. "We have to destroy its tether. That altar in the cavern, it's what anchors it here. If we destroy the altar, it'll break the connection." They returned to Cedarwood Grill under the cover of darkness, the air thick with dread. The restaurant was closed, but the faint hum of activity emanated from within. Jack and Sarah slipped through the woods, entering the cavern through a back entrance Sarah had discovered. The air grew colder as they descended, and the chanting voices reached their ears long before they saw the masked figures. The ritual was in full swing, the altar slick with fresh blood. Jack's stomach turned as he recognized the limp form on the stone, a local teenager who had gone missing the week before. Sarah gripped his arm, her face pale but determined. "We can't let them see us," she whispered. "The book says the fire will sever the tether. We just need to get close enough." They moved silently, sticking to the shadows as they approached the altar. Jack's heart pounded as the shadow began to manifest, its towering form emerging from the darkness. The sight of it froze him in place. It was larger now, more defined, its limbs twisting unnaturally as it loomed over the altar. Sarah lit a match, her hands shaking as she set fire to the oil she had poured in a circle around the altar. The flames roared to life and the chanting stopped. The masked figures turned as one, their hollow eyes fixed on Jack and Sarah. The shadow let out a deafening roar, its form writhing as the flames encroached. The figures lunged toward them, but Jack and Sarah stood their ground, the fire forming a barrier between them and the cult. The shadow thrashed, its limbs stretching toward the ceiling as it let out an otherworldly scream. And then, with a final, shuddering roar, it was gone. The altar cracked and crumbled, the flames consuming the blood and symbols until there was nothing left but ash. Jack and Sarah stumbled out of the cavern as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The air was heavy with smoke, But for the first time in days, Jack felt a sense of peace. The shadow was gone, its tether severed. But as they drove away from Cedarwood, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The shadows along the road seemed darker, and Sarah's silence was unnerving. When he glanced at her, her reflection in the rearview mirror didn't quite match her face. The shadow was gone. Or was it the days after the ritual were meant to be a reprieve, but Jack quickly realized there was no such thing as peace. He had left Cedarwood behind, driving aimlessly across state lines with Sarah at his side. Her silence was heavy, almost oppressive. She hadn't said much since they destroyed the altar, and Jack didn't press her. Something about her demeanor, the far-off look in her eyes, unsettled him, but he told himself they had won. The shadow was gone. The tether was severed. Wasn't it? They settled in a cheap motel just outside of a small town. The flickering neon sign read vacancy, though the place looked more abandoned than operational. Jack locked the door and double-checked the windows, a ritual he'd repeated every night since the ordeal. He turned to Sarah, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She didn't answer at first. Then, without looking up, she whispered, Do you feel it?" Jack hesitated. The room wasn't cold. If anything, it was stifling with the busted AC. He shook his head. "It's just your nerves. After everything we went through, it's normal to feel off." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes hollow. "It's not nerves, Jack. It's still with us." That night, Jack dreamed of the shadow. He was back in the cavern, but it was empty. No altar, no cult. Just the endless dark. Yet, he wasn't alone. The shadow was there, its form towering above him, limbs curling and uncurling as though it were deciding how best to devour him. "You think it's over," it hissed, its voice a low rumble that echoed in his skull. "You think you can run, but you cannot escape me. I am in the cracks, in the spaces between. I am in you." Jack woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The room was dark, but the air felt suffocating. He reached out for Sarah, only to find her side of the bed empty. "Sarah?" he called, his voice trembling. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, a dim light spilling out. Jack got up, his legs shaky, and approached. The sound of water dripping echoed faintly, and as he pushed the door open, he froze. Sarah was standing in front of the mirror, her hands gripping the edges of the sink. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes locked onto her reflection. She didn't blink, didn't move, but her lips were moving, mouthing words Jack couldn't hear. "Sarah?" he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. Instead, her head turned slowly, too slowly, until her eyes met his. They were no longer Sarah's eyes. They were black voids, infinite and consuming. Jack stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's not over," she said, her voice layered with something inhuman, something ancient. "You severed the tether, but you set it free." The days that followed blurred together in a haze of paranoia and fear. Sarah grew more distant, her behavior increasingly erratic. She spoke less, and when she did, her words carried an unfamiliar edge. Jack caught her staring at him when she thought he wasn't looking, her expression unreadable. The dreams persisted. The shadow appeared every night, closer and more tangible. Jack would wake with the sensation of cold fingers brushing against his skin, or the faint sound of whispering in his ear. He tried to tell himself it was his mind playing tricks, but the weight of the shadow followed him everywhere, pressing down on his chest like an invisible hand. Then came the writing. It started small, a single symbol scrawled on the motel's bathroom mirror, drawn in steam. Jack wiped it away, but the next morning it was back, joined by others. Strange, angular shapes that made his head ache if he stared too long. They began appearing everywhere, on the walls, the windows, even etched faintly into the wood of the nightstand. "Sarah," he demanded one night, holding her by the shoulders. "What's happening? What did we unleash?" She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It's angry," she whispered. "We heard it. It wants to make us pay." "For what?" Jack shouted, desperation lacing his voice. What does it want from us? Sarah finally met his eyes, and for a moment, he saw the shadow flicker behind them. It doesn't want us, Jack. It wants you. The breaking point came on the 5th night. Jack woke to the sound of Sarah's voice, low and chanting. He turned to find her standing at the foot of the bed, her arms raised, her body swaying. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "What are you doing?" Jack demanded, his voice trembling. Sarah didn't answer. The room began to shake, a low rumble vibrating through the floor. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, pulsing in time with her words. Jack scrambled out of bed, grabbing her arm. "Stop this! Sarah, stop!" Her head snapped toward him, her expression blank. "It's too late," she said, her voice a hollow echo. "It's here." The room erupted in chaos. The walls cracked, shadows spilling out like ink, the temperature plummeted, and Jack felt his breath freeze in his lungs. The shadow emerged from the darkness, larger and more menacing than ever. Its form was no longer formless, it was solid, its limbs long and spindly, its face a void of shifting shapes. "You cannot run," it hissed. "You cannot hide." Jack pulled Sarah toward the door, but the shadow moved faster, cutting them off. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, blocking their escape. Jack could feel its presence in his mind, probing, searching. "You severed my tether," it said, "but you made me whole." Jack didn't know where the strength came from, but he grabbed a lamp from the nightstand and hurled it at the shadow. It shattered harmlessly. But the sudden action gave him and Sarah enough time to dart past it. They fled the room, the shadow's laughter echoing behind them. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of town. Jack's lungs burned, his legs shaking, but he forced himself to keep going. Sarah stumbled, falling to her knees. "We can't escape it," she gasped. "It's everywhere." Jack knelt beside her, gripping her shoulders. "We have to try. There has to be a way." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Jack. It's inside me. It's inside you. It's never going to let us go." For a moment, Jack considered giving up. The weight of the shadow, the endless fear, was too much to bear. But then he thought of the people who had been consumed by it, the lives destroyed. He couldn't let it win. "We fight," he said firmly. "We find a way to end this." The shadow watched from the darkness as they disappeared into the night, its form twisting and rippling. It wasn't worried. It didn't need to follow them. It was already with them. It always would be. If you are interested in the dark details of this story, please leave a comment with your thoughts. Click the like button to support, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more scary stories.